Hello and welcome to this edition of the Florida Writer Podcast. Today, I am lucky enough to have with me Laura Krughoff. Laura, why don't you give me your 60-second elevator pitch about who you are and what you write?
Hi, and thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. I write mostly fiction about women in the American Midwest. I just had a little mini book of short stories out from Scarletta Press that covered about 100 years of women in the Midwest. And I have recently finished a novel about lesbians and marriage and coming out and family in the 10 years between Massachusetts legalizing same-sex marriage and the end of DOMA in America.
Well, that sounds really interesting. And so you covered 100 years of America. Did you have to do a lot of research for that?
Well, in the mini book, it was mostly family stories. So I was just really thinking about the women in my life and the women in my family and their lives. And I actually have some really long-lived relatives. My grandparents' generation has all passed on at this point, but I had great aunts who lived well into their hundreds. And so just thinking about their lives and thinking about how to capture something about their lives meant thinking about 100 years of history. So once I started doing that, it was kind of wild to see that history unfold in my fiction.
I love that idea. There's so many people that always talk about capturing the memories of their family, and they never do it.
Mm-hmm.
You were able to actually interview people you know and refer to stories that you've been told and be able to put them on paper.
Yeah.
How true are the stories, even though they're fiction?
They are true in spirit. I didn't get too anxious about nitty-gritty details. I wrote from memory. I wrote from conversations. I wrote from sort of the sense I had about these wonderful women who were in my life. And by the time I was writing about them, they were mostly not here anymore. It felt like once a relative had died, that the possibility of writing about them and for them and to them sort of opened up in a way that didn't feel quite as possible when you're in the middle of a relationship with somebody. So I tried to pay attention and to run stories by other family members and say, hey, didn't this happen, or was this when Aunt Pauline was doing this or that? But I didn't go to the history books so much as just to the family for fact checking, I guess.
That is very special that you were able to do that and have those conversations with people and keep the stories alive, even when they're fictionalized, because that's kind of, isn't that what lore is? I mean, folklore,
yeah.
Just family stories that are passed down.
Yeah, absolutely. My mother had been the caretaker for that generation of her parents' family. So both her parents, as they were, getting elderly and moving into that phase of life, and then also her aunts, a number of her aunts. She was really involved in their end of life care and just attending to them. And so it felt like this generational thing that was happening as my mother was sort of caretaking this generation out of the world. And I was, trying to be a support and a listening ear for her. So it did feel multi-generational. And I'd never really thought about writing autobiographically before this little mini book of stories. We all get our inspiration from the worlds we're living in, but I had never felt like I mined my own life until this particular set of stories. And then it felt like not mining my life, but mining our life, a really collective sense of what it meant to be in the world. And that was really fun. It was just really fun to turn to that material at this point.
Are they written as a typical short story, or do you have any experimental forms that you've been able to use?
Well, actually, mostly they are experimental forms. So there are a couple of stories in the collection that do feel very standard, very traditional short story, and they're actually the most far from life, the most thoroughly fiction pieces in the book, but the other four, I think, and looking in my head at the table of contents, the other four short stories are not standard in any way. There's a story about my great aunt called "By the Time You Are 100," and it is written in second person, and it tries to capture her whole life, which was a very joyful and wonderful life, but it captures that whole life by marking the people who died, because by the time you're 100, all the people you've loved have died. And in her family, her mother died when she was young, when she was adolescent. And so the story begins there and then just kind of does, I guess, 88 years of her life, just marking through the way a person encounters death over life. There was another story that wasn't a family story, but was a story in my community that had to do with a murder, a presumed murder, or a presumed murder. It was framed as a hunting accident, and I wasn't sure I believed that it was an accident. And in that story, I tell the story entirely through questions. There isn't a single sentence in the story that ends with a period, because I discovered that I wasn't interested in what I knew. I was only interested in what I didn't know. So rather than trying to imagine what I didn't know, I simply asked those questions and tried to tell the whole story through that series of questions, of possibilities, of uncertainties. So I moved in really different directions, and that's not all that typical for me. A lot of my fiction is pretty standard American realism with plots and conflicts and characters and scenes, and these stories just went in a different direction.
And you've classified them as Midwestern stories. So how would you define a Midwestern?
Oh, gosh. Well, I grew up in Indiana, so my Midwest is a little further east than some people's Midwest. Some people would put that in like Nebraska and don't understand what we mean when we say Indiana or Ohio is the Midwest. But I think broadly what I mean is something about the plainness of the landscape and the kind of straightforwardness of the people. I lived most of my life in the Midwest. I lived in Indiana growing up. I moved to Chicago as a young adult, lived briefly in Michigan, but I'd really been in that triangle for my whole life until I moved to Tacoma, Washington for 5 years ago, about 5 years now. And so I just wrote about the people I knew and where I'd been and what the landscape looked like when I opened my eyes. And now that I don't live there anymore, I see it so thoroughly as a place that is about openness, though not necessarily honesty. And I mean that in like almost the landscape too, as well as the people. And something about plainness. And I think the family stories I've been telling are rich and deep and also really plain. And I love that about it. It took me a long time to figure out that was something to love and not something to try to move away from as a person or a writer.
That is a beautifully stated way to describe the Midwestern genre that you are identifying. And I think that, when we can personify place, it really does add a richness to the characters, because then place interacts with the characters and creates that extra layer of depth without having to be complex.
Yeah, I really think so. And I can't anymore, I just can't quite feature characters that aren't tied to a place. I'm not sure what that would look like for me. And yeah, I've written about Chicago as well. Chicago shows up in my fiction, and it is deeply Midwestern, but it's obviously a very different landscape than the kind of rural landscape that I grew up in and that lots of my fiction is set in. But yeah, I couldn't pick up the characters out of Chicago and plop them into some other American city. I couldn't do it. I don't think it wouldn't work for my imagination.
It would feel alien.
It would, yeah. And now that I've lived in the Pacific Northwest for 5 years, I've begun to kind of look around and wonder, well, what would I write about this place, right? Like, what would the characters look like, and who would they be, and what would they do? And I don't have any idea. I'm not ready to make that transition. I don't know yet.
So creating a landscape that is also a person, and I find that Snow Falling on Cedars that you talked about living in Washington successfully did that, because that landscape is so part of the characters. It was actually one of the only movies that I think is almost as good or equally as good as the book, which I find very, very rare. But I did find that particular book, the scenery and the way it's described, it's like this slow pace, and yet it's so richly developed. And that, that's just, when we can do that as authors, we can really capture everything. It's like we're breathing at a very slow, meditative rate.
Yeah, because the landscape has its own life to it, but it's happening on a different time scale than the lives of the people running around within that landscape. And I think maybe that play between the life of the landscape and the life of the people in it might be really rich.
Again, beautifully put. I like that you talk about them living the landscape has a different time element than we humans do. The clock is different. Like, in many ways it is, because we might live to 100 like your aunts did, but the earth is eons. And wow. Okay.
Yeah.
When I say wow, I don't sound very intelligent, but that's the word that came to mind just now. You've also written a novel called My Brother's Name. And I read a review that said it's a gripping read for anyone who loves masterful prose and provocative questions about gender, bodies, minds, and love. Tell me a little bit about the novel and the title.
Yeah, so the novel is about a brother and a sister who are very close and deeply connected to each other. And over the course of the novel, or as the novel opens, the older brother, they're young adults, just sort of barely into their adulthood. The older brother has suffered the onset of a pretty major mental illness, and is suffering with the treatment of that major mental illness. And he and his sister devise this notion that maybe what he needs is not treatment, but just to get away from their parents, to get away from doctors, to get away from diagnoses. And so the two of them go, sort of leaving a more small town, Midwestern childhood, and move to a city that is very much Chicago, to try to create space for him and for themselves. And in that space, they develop this plan that he will stay home and try to get well, and she will adopt his identity and pass as him in the world. She'll go out into the world as her brother and bring back the stories of the life he gets to keep on living vicariously through her. So it's not a novel about a trans character or about gender passing as a strategy of survival, but about this really pragmatic and very strange and perhaps unwell system that these two people develop to try to keep him, or the idea of him, in the world in some fashion. And the question I was really interested in was, to what extent does pretending to be something really manifest it and make it in the world? To what extent are we intrinsically something, and to what extent are we the stories that we tell about ourselves? And so in the novel, I really follow the sister as the main character and her experience of developing identity that she comes to really love. And comes to really enjoy and feel at home in, even though it's not her own, and what happens between them because of that. And I didn't sort of inspired. I've been writing a short story about this brother and sister pair that wasn't quite the genesis of the novel yet. And I had a really good friend who worked in the mental health field, and I was telling her about this story and about this relationship and about these siblings. And she said, "Have you ever heard of the psychiatric diagnosis shared delusions?" And I said, "No." And she said, "You might want to look it up." And it is a rare diagnosis that sometimes in a deeply intimate relationship where one person has a major mental illness with psychotic associations, people very close to them can start to participate in those delusions and be sort of swept into the delusions. And so I read up about shared delusions and when and how that diagnosis gets made and what it means to live really closely with and really intimately with someone whose reality is not your own, and when and how that can start to seep into your own reality as well.
I need to ask, this is such a complex subject. Did you find yourself as a writer investing almost too much time and energy into this understanding of these type of relationships?
I spent a lot of time on research with that, and it took me a long time to write the novel. I think it took 6 years, maybe a little more, start to finish. And it was my first novel, and so I was learning how to write a novel, and that is a project, and doesn't seem to be one that you can rush. But I also spent a lot of time just reading and thinking. I read a lot of memoirs written by people who were typically the siblings of people with major mental illness, to just get a feel of what that family dynamic is like and what it might be like to be the well sibling in a situation where the family is really taken by a diagnosis and the illness of one of the family members. So I did a lot of reading about that, and a lot of reading for the texture of what that family might be like. I think of it really as a love story. I mean, this brother and sister love each other a lot, but it's not a love story that we're accustomed to hearing.
I know I've read Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, and she's describing a woman who is basically put up into an attic room and she goes crazy. And it's so well done, captures that. Hers is more of a postpartum depression, but she goes into something crazy. And it's a interesting story. I just am fascinated when people start writing about personalities that are extreme and how that becomes, because we become emotionally attached to our characters, or at least I do. I feel what they feel. I act the way they act, in the sense that I am like trying to make it realistic. And I find there's got to be some hint of, you had to have walked in those shoes for at least a dream state in order to make it realistic. But I congratulate you upon doing that. I think that is phenomenal. And it sounds like you've had a lot of success with it, and you've won. Did you win an award, or you became a runner-up with one?
Yeah, it was shortlisted for a Lambda Literary Award in debut fiction when it came out.
That is fantastic. Well, congratulations on that success.
Yeah.
Laura,
Thank you.
Yeah, we're going to shift gears, and we are going to move into our rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
I am ready.
Do you prefer still water or sparkling?
Oh, still water after a workout, sparkling after a long day.
Oh, okay. I like that idea. It's hard to drink sparkling water after a workout. I will agree with that.
It's true.
How many states do you think you have visited?
Oh, I would guess like 10, if we mean been there and seen things and spent some time there. I've driven across the country twice, but I don't think it quite counts if you've only gotten out of the car to get gas.
True that. And then, will you eat alone at a restaurant?
Yes, I love it.
You love it. It took me a long time. I would say I was probably 45 before I would even eat alone in a restaurant.
Oh, there's something really blissful about it to me. And I think people eating comfortably alone at a restaurant look mysterious and interesting. And like maybe they're from out of town. And even if I'm just down the block from my own house, I kind of like feeling mysterious and interesting and like maybe I'm from out of town.
Do you take a book with you?
I usually do, but I often don't read it.
It's one of the greatest places we can capture life without anybody knowing.
Yes, I think so.
Well, Laura Krughoff, thank you so much for joining me on the Florida Writer Podcast. I need to ask you, Laura, how can people get in touch with you?
Yes. My website is www.laurakrughoff.com, and I can be found there.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much. That was really fun.
That's all for today. Allison out. Laura Krughoff is the author of the mini-book of short fiction, Wake in the Night, published by Scarletta Press. She's also the author of My Brother's Name, a novel which was shortlisted for a Lambda Literary Award for debut fiction. Her nonfiction has appeared in national media outlets including the Huffington Post, Chicago Sun-Times, Writer's Digest, SheWired, and Dot429 Magazine. Her short fiction has also won a Pushcart Prize and was runner-up for the Chicago Tribune Nelson Algren Award. Currently, Laura is an assistant professor of creative writing at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington, where she also serves on the board of the Gender and Queer Studies program. For more information on the Florida Writers Association, visit us on the web at floridawriters.net.